the politics of control was not just limited to the conquest of territories or, economic control or political control. It also extended to other things, and it extended to the kind of things that were being studied. For example, as a student of literature, there were some texts that you were expected to study. If you really are a good student of literature, you ought to have read these. And so the books on that list, that list was the canon. And a good student of literature was expected to have read those. So if you go back to your days of graduation or school days or something, if you're reading a Mills and Boon or a Harry Potter or an Agatha Christie, your teacher might have told you, no, that's not the right thing to read. Read Jane Austen. So things like this. There was a very definite distinction between what one should read, what qualifies as good literature, acceptable reading, and what does not. So, culture originally had a very, very different meaning. It meant everything of a high order, the cultivated taste. The cultivated taste of a privileged few. Later on, this view got challenged. Now, let's see what all happened after the Second World War. After the Second World War, roughly after 1945, there were major changes in the whole world is one thing, but there were some really important changes that were happening in Great Britain and in British circles. Earlier, there was a certain kind of lifestyle associated with the ordinary people. So the ordinary working classes, people belonging to the working class, they had some corner shops, or they had some public libraries. There were clubs for these working class men. And all these things somehow blended beautifully with their communal life. So there was entertainment. They did have their own ways of entertaining themselves, and they had a kind of communal living which was very healthy and good for them. But after the Second World War, there was an intrusion, and this popular culture, the culture of the working class, this popular culture received some outside influences. These outside influences were mainly, American influences. So there were television serials and films and comic strips and things like that. And the mass media was beginning to replace this kind of, going to the corner shop or going to a public library or some such thing. These things were set aside and a new kind of influence was threatening to take over. Now, in the year 1957, there was this man called Richard Hogarth. He belonged to these, he was from this working class. And he wrote a book called The Uses of Literacy, and this happened in the year 1957. Originally, he had planned to title it The Abuses of Literacy, but he called his book The Uses of Literacy, and he did not expect that the book would win him the kind of, fame and recognition that it brought to him. Now, this Uses of Literacy is in two parts. In the first part, it looks at the life of the working class before the war, before the World War. What kind of a life it was, what did they have, all those, corner shops and public libraries and men's parlor for working class men. It takes a look at all that. And in the second part, it takes a look at the influences which have come from outside. So mass culture is replacing popular culture. Popular culture existed before the World War, and now mass culture is coming and trying to replace this. It has a great influence, and this caused a great concern to somebody like Richard Hogarth. Now, this man and two others, E.P. Thompson, now he was a Marxist cultural critic, and Raymond Williams, these three will get together to form the CCC. It is going to be the Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies in 1964 in Birmingham, in the University of Birmingham. So this is going to have a major influence, and these three are going to be the founding fathers of cultural studies in Great Britain. Later on, a black British cultural critic called Stuart Hall will also come into the picture, and we will have to know what the contribution of these people was to the field of cultural studies. In the 20th century, there have been several intellectual movements in Europe. We are not talking of cultural studies because cultural studies is not a movement. But there were intellectual movements in Europe such as phenomenology, hermeneutics, and later on it will go on to other things. And we need to have a very brief understanding of these movements, and we will do it systematically. As we saw in an earlier video, we saw two things. We saw the left-right position, and in that left-right position we saw that the left stood for equality and the right stood for hierarchy and order. Now, within the Marxist circles, there came about a group known as the New Left. They are going to question some of the principles of Marxism. Stuart Hall will be a part of this, E.P. Thompson will be a part of this, Raymond Williams will be a part of this. These are all the New Left people. And the New Left, as well as the Frankfurt School, these are going to exert a tremendous influence on cultural studies. We look at the Frankfurt School, we look at these schools systematically in later videos, but what we need to understand is, why did these intellectual movements happen and what were they trying to do? During the phase of humanism, there were judgments, there were opinions, there were views, and they were accepted. But one thing that happened was that the human mind became the center of everything rather than some divine agency. When the human mind became the center of things and everything is coming from the human mind, it naturally followed in the 20th century, when humanism got replaced by other things, the question that came about was that if meaning comes from the human mind and if the human mind is the center for everything, how can we trust that this is an absolute statement and this can be treated as a full and final statement about something? And so more and more explorations via the human mind, they started happening. Now, the age of enlightenment had happened in the past. The age of enlightenment had happened. And after the age of enlightenment, these intellectual movements will also play their role in furthering knowledge and understanding of everything related to the world and everything related to human understanding. So cultural studies will question many things. Who decides that this is culture and this is not? Who decides that Shakespeare or Milton or Jane Austen, these make for good reading for a good literature student or a student of literature? And who decides that Agatha Christie or Harry Potter or comics should not be read? Or at least they don't qualify as standard literature and only some things qualify as standard literature. Who takes these decisions? Now these have power politics behind them. So who decides these things? Who designates that this is culture and this is not? So these were some of the things that came up. And slowly, universities started restructuring their syllabus. And in many of the universities, comic studies and other kinds of studies which were earlier not treated as standard literature, all these found their way into the syllabus. So cultural studies is going to look at culture in a very different way. Who decides this is culture and this is not? Who took this decision that culture is restricted to the few? Culture is a way of life. And if it is a way of life, then the way of life of the many, rather than the way of life of some, should be taken into account. So, the way of life, the preferences, the choices, the tastes of the many, the majority, that should also be taken into consideration. Earlier, what used to happen was the choices, the tastes of the majority was scorned. It was treated as tasteless, classless. It is the choice of the crass, not the choice of the class. So that clear distinction was there between the class and the crass. Now those distinctions will get blurred. And people like Raymond Williams, in his keywords, he will argue in favor of the choices of the majority. All that will be included in culture. It will no longer remain a restricted thing.